There's a lot of research that shows that optimistic people live on average 10 years or more longer than pessimistic people. And one of the most powerful tools or strategies that you can use to become optimistic is to imagine your best possible self or your desired future self. What psychologists invite people to do, and I'm going to invite you to do it in this video. And by the way, this is going to be a part of a Future Self series course that's going to be here on this YouTube channel, and you can watch it. There's going to be 30 videos that are going to be breaking down all of the best research to help you become your best self, your desired future self. But what psychologists recommend you do is you think about your best possible self 5 to 10 years into the future. You can choose the timeline, 5 to 10 years, but literally take the time to sit and then write who you want your future self to be. Write down all the key attributes you want to have. And if you give yourself 10 to 15 minutes to just do this, sit down, you could choose 5 years from now or 10 years from now, and just list out who your future self is, who your best possible self is. What this activity has been found to do is boost your optimism. Now, there's a lot of obvious reasons why. First off, your view of your future is the thing that determines how you feel in the present. It's two things. Your view of the future and also your view of the past largely shape how you feel in the present. If you have a compelling and exciting future, Viktor Frankl, who wrote the book Man's Search for Meaning, he talks a lot about how you need hope and purpose towards your future, or else the present becomes really painful. Dan Sullivan, the founder of Strategic Coach, actually says the only way to make your present better is by making your future bigger. And that's exactly what Viktor Frankl found. Viktor Frankl was living through the concentration camps. He was one of the Jews in World War II, and he wrote the book Man's Search for Meaning. And he talks about how what man needs is not a tensionless state, but rather the striving and struggling for a worthwhile goal. He also says that life is never unbearable by circumstance, but by having a loss of meaning and purpose. So what Frankl found was that when people in the concentration camps lost hope in their future, they died. And so one of the reasons why this activity is so powerful about defining your best possible self, your future self, is it gives you a clear view of your future, which then allows you to feel good about the present, and it gives your life direction and it gives it purpose and meaning. So that is crucial, that is powerful. There's also something I want you to know. There's a lot of research from the psychologist, Dr. Carol Dweck. She was a Stanford psychologist. She's the one who coined the terms growth mindset and fixed mindset. And what she found is that people with a growth mindset, they're very clear on their future self. They're clear on who they want to be, and they're more defined by their future self than they are by their current self. Whereas people with a fixed mindset, they're defined by where they're at right now. They don't actually believe that their future self is going to be any different, and so they wouldn't actually do this activity of defining their best possible self because they think that who they are right now is who they're going to always be. That's the idea of a fixed mindset. You think your characteristics are permanent, your personality is permanent, your skills are permanent. Fixed mindset people are victims to their current self, and they overly identify their current self, and they also are the kinds of people who would want things like a personality test to tell them who they are. Really, what a fixed mindset is it's about overly identifying with your current self. It's about thinking who you are is who you're going to always be. And the truth of the matter, and there's a lot of research on this, particularly from Daniel Gilbert from Harvard, is that your future self is going to be a lot different than you expect them to be. Your future self is going to have different knowledge, different experiences. They're going to have different priorities, different values, different goals than you have right now. They're going to see the world differently than you. Just like if you really were to think about it, chances are you see the world differently than your former self. Think about who you were 5 years ago or 10 years ago. Chances are you have different goals, different beliefs, different priorities, different attitudes and habits, especially if you're someone who's very growth oriented. So the key point here is don't put too much stock in your current self. You should love and appreciate where you're at right now. And you can really do that, especially by taking the time to reflect on who you were in the past and appreciating the growth and the progress you've made right now. Really enjoying and embracing and appreciating your own progress is key to feeling happy, feeling appreciative right now. There's one other key aspect I'll just give you right here. When it comes to framing your past, you want to frame everything in what Dan Sullivan would call a gain rather than a gap. A lot of people, they view their past as something negative, but you can view every experience as a gain, even trauma experiences, even hard experiences. If you choose to view it as this is something I can use to make my future better, then you can choose to have a positive past. And what you need to realize is the past is just a meaning. It's literally just a meaning. You're going to change how you feel about certain things in the future. And so whatever the event was that occurred, it's not the event that matters, it's the meaning you give to the event. You can choose a positive or a negative meaning. Just as an example, my father was a drug addict when I was growing up. And I can choose to be in the gap about that. And when you're in the gap, you're comparing what is to some ideal which you wish it was. So if I'm in the gap, then I'm saying, why wasn't my past better? Why couldn't it have been what I wanted it to be? Why did my dad have to be a drug addict? My other friends didn't have drug addicts for dads. That's called being in the gap. You're always comparing what is to some non-existent ideal. Just as another example, I take my kids to Disneyland. We give them a cookie, and one of my kids is like complaining because his cookie is smaller than the other kid's cookie. That's the gap. That's measuring yourself and what you have against either someone else or some ideal in your head that doesn't exist. So when it comes to your past, you want to be in the gain. You want to frame it as, what can I have because of this? And you can choose to frame anything as a gain. You go to the gym and you're working out, you're gaining progress. You're better now because of what you're doing. You look at the past, even your hardest experiences. What are the benefits that came from that? What are the good that can come from that? Or what do you now know that will empower you in the future so you don't have to repeat that? Lessons are repeated until learned. And so ultimately you want a past that you appreciate, even the hard aspects of it, because you've given it a good meaning, a gain meaning. And you can appreciate the past, but you're anticipating an exciting future. So one other thing I'll give you on this, after you've imagined your best future self, what I want you to do is I want you to imagine having a conversation between your best future self and your former self. Think if they had a conversation, and you could do this in your journal if you want, or you could just do it in your imagination, but what would your best future self, first off, what would they say to you right now? Chances are, if you were to have a conversation with your best possible future self 5 or 10 years from now, and let's just say that they've accomplished all the goals that you want to accomplish, what would they say to you right now if you were to go and have lunch with them? You can even imagine meeting them anywhere. You could think of a great environment or a great location that would be meaningful, but think of a great spot and imagine yourself going and having a meal, or even just sitting by a really cool fireplace or whatever, sitting and talking to your future self. What would they tell you right now? That would be something to journal about. Chances are they would tell you that you're going to be successful. They would tell you that you don't need to have as much fear or worry or concern that you probably have, that you should move forward. I mean, only you know what they would tell you. But if you take the time to sit and reflect on that and think about the conversation that your future self would have for you, then you could start to get a lot of clarity about what you should do right now. Stephen Covey actually talks about imagining your 80th birthday party and the type of person you want to be and the impact you want to have on people and the legacy you've left. That's kind of a begin with end in mind thinking. You can allow your future self or your best possible self to ultimately give you the path of where you need to go from here to where you want to go. And that's going to obviously boost your motivation. According to the expectancy theory of motivation, there's 3 aspects of motivation. One is you have to have a clear and compelling goal. The second is you have to have a path to getting there. And the third is you've got to build the confidence that you can actually do it. And so by having a conversation with your future self, by getting clear on what you need to do, you can then start to develop that path, which gives you enhanced motivation. Another thing you can do is to imagine your future self going back in time essentially and talking with your former self. Maybe think about some aspect of your life when it was very challenging, very difficult. It might have been a very hard or a dark or a rough period of your life. What would your best self, your best future self, say to your former self? Or even what would you say to your former self if you could go back there right now and talk to them? Because you are the future self of your former self. And it's really important to be compassionate towards your former self. Really important to not regret your former self's decisions. There's no point in regretting the past. That's being in the gap. That's measuring yourself against what you wish it was versus appreciating where you are now versus where you were in the past. You're not the same person you used to be. So that is the activity I recommend you have. On this Future Self series, I'm going to teach you how to clarify, define your future self, and then ultimately I'm going to give you the most powerful strategies you can have to ultimately becoming your future self fast, because your future self has a different identity than you do. Your identity is how you see and describe yourself. It's how you define yourself. And ultimately what you want to do is you want to clarify your best future self. And then you want to embody that identity here and now. There's a concept you have to be before you can do and do before you can have. And so ultimately you want to be, then do, then have. And that happens when you start to identify with your future self. You start to talk like your future self. You start to ultimately behave in the ways that you want to so that you can start producing the results you want. Once you start being the person you want to be and doing what they would do, then you can have what your future self would have, whatever that may be. It could be a situation, it could be money, it could be relationships, it could be whatever you want. You just have to get clear on the result you want And then ultimately, you need to begin identifying as that person. And I'll break down all of the research on how you can ultimately shift your identity, upgrade your behavior, and that's going to just be all throughout this Future Self YouTube series. In psychology, your motivation is either approach or avoid. Rather than trying to avoid what you don't want, which is a willpower way of trying to make change, what you want to do is you want to clarify what you want, and then you want to spend your time and energy approaching that. The more you do something, the more you'll want it. The more you'll do something, the more you start to see more and more of it. There's a great quote from Robert Kiyosaki. He said, "Intelligence is the ability to make finer distinctions." Finer distinctions means your worldview gets clearer and more specific. Rather than trying to avoid what you don't want, you clarify what you do want, and you just feed that. You feed that beast, and you start to develop clear and clearer perspective of it. You become more of an expert on it. You start to see distinctions. Where someone sees one frame, you see 50. You get a more clear expertise and perspective, and you can then move that forward. So approach what you want rather than trying to avoid what you don't. Clarify what you want, and then really educate yourself on that thing, and you'll start to become less blind, and you can actively prepare right now for your future self. What other people think about you is none of your business. At a certain level, you need to get to a place in your mindset and your identity where you can trust yourself, where you can own what you want, and you can hear people, you can get feedback, you can get advice, but at some point or another, you're the final say. And you do have to walk away from even what your friends, family think, what your friends on social media think, and even what your mentors or even your teachers say. At some point or another, you've got to be the one to decide what you want, and you've got to go for it with everything you've got, and you've got to get to the place where you're like, it doesn't really matter what other people say. This is what I'm going for. I'm going to own this. I'm going to do this. According to the self-determination theory, which is one of the amazing theories in motivation, we all need to get to a place of pure intrinsic motivation, pure autonomy, pure competence, pure freedom. And that level of freedom, that level of motivation means that you've blocked out all external reference points, external noise. You're just purely autonomous in what you're doing. You decide what you want. You decide the level you're going to go to. Yes, you can use resources. You can get teachers, things like that. You can have aids, and you can even have competition to some degree, but you're the one who's purely decided what you're going to do. You're doing it for the sake of the thing. You love it. You've got your motives, you've got your reasons, and it's purely self-decided. There's actually a really great quote from Naval Ravikant. One of the things he says, happiness is a purely internal game. You can't have any external validation. There is no external progress. At the end of the day, as human beings, all progress is internal. It's a one-player game. And if you're still playing on the outside, if you're still competing with other people, if you're still trying to get other people's approval, then you're actually playing a multiplayer game, and you're not actually making any progress as a human being. At some point or another, you realize happiness, success, progress is all an inside job. It's an inside game. That's why the self-determination theory is so powerful, is because at some place, you get to a point where it's just pure intrinsic motivation, pure autonomy. You choose what you want, and then you decide the price you're willing to pay. Now, the question that is regularly asked is, how do I actually even begin to imagine 10x? I don't even know how to think that high because I'm already exhausted and working hard at what I'm doing, and so I can't even begin to imagine 10x. And that's a really brilliant question, and it forces you to ask yourself a few other questions. One of the things I love that Dan Sullivan teaches is the idea that 10x is easier than 2x. Now, there's a few reasons why 10x thinking is easier than 2x. One of the reasons is that if you were to take a goal and then make it 10x bigger, what that would force you to do is it would force you to ask, is this the thing you really want to 10x? Because if you're going to 10x something, it's going to force you to probably quit doing a lot of the other things you're doing. Because you can't 10x everything. and so you have to ask yourself, where do I really want to go big? And so just choose any area of your life. Let's just say you have 4 main areas. You may have your career, your family, your health. Or you may even have niches within your career. As an example, like for me, I write books, but I also, make YouTube videos, and I also have a coaching program. And so if I were to ask myself, what do I want to 10x? Let's just say I want to 10x as an author. If I truly want to 10x as an author, meaning either I write 10 times more books, or I sell 10 times as many books as I'm currently writing, or maybe I write a 10 times better book. There's a lot of different aspects of 10x. You've got to ask yourself, what's the most important metric for you? For me, is it writing 10 times more books? Is it selling 10 times more books? Or is it writing one book that's 10 times better than anything I've ever written? But if I just decide, let's just call it that books and being an author and writing is the area that I want to get 10 times better, and I'm really committed to going 10 times in that area, what that would force me to ask myself is, okay, then what else am I currently doing right now that's getting in the way of me going 10x? What am I going to have to immediately quit doing if I'm serious about going higher at this? Because if you're going to take on one goal at 10x, that means you've got to let go of other things. And when it comes to being a business, rather than trying to take five products really great to the market, you just take one. You just really niche down. You actually focus on like, what's the one thing that would make the biggest difference. And once you get up there, you can pull other things up. You can laterally adjust, and you can do some lateral thinking at every step you take up. So as an example, before Apple jumped into phones, they mastered MP3. They like really dialed in iPods. And once iPods blew up, and obviously before that even it was computers, but iPods really put Apple on the map. And then they could easily lateral that to phones and then iPads. But in the beginning it was iPods. And so yes, you can go lateral as you go up, but they were applying the same principles. So they didn't try to do iPods, phones, and iPads at the same time. They did one really brilliantly, and then they went lateral from there. So I'm not saying you can't do multiple things, but I'm just asking you, if you were to go 10x in one, what would that immediately require you to let go of? And why this is such a good question is it forces you to actually evaluate your own value system. What do you value more than the other things you're doing? This then brings up a brilliant question from Robert Brault. Robert Brault says, we're kept from our goal not by obstacles, but by a clear path to a lesser goal. So it's not obstacles between you and your future self that are stopping you. It's actually that you have clear paths to lesser future selves. It's that you're still overly committed to lesser goals. You're caught in the thick of 10 things. You're undecided. You're uncommitted. You're still committing to too many things, keeping too many doors open, having too many foots in too many doors. Barry Schwartz, the psychologist, would call this the paradox of choice. That it's hard to make a committed decision because with committed decisions comes opportunity cost. You have to actually say no to other sides of yourself. One question you have to ask yourself if you want to go 10x or even begin to envision 10x is, what's the area of your life that's worth 10xing? You can go 10x in multiple areas of your life, but I would invite you to just choose one at a time. Which area is the most important for you to 10x right now? It's kind of like the parable of bird and ass, or like the donkey, where the donkey is between a bundle of hay and a pail of water, and because it's trying to get both at once, and ultimately it ends up dying of starvation and thirst, and if it would have just gone to the hay first, boom, knocked that out, and then gone and drank the water, or vice versa, it could have had both. But if you're trying to do all at once, and this is a problem that a lot of people like in their 20s and 30s have, is they're trying to accomplish too many goals all at once rather than really going deep and far in one, and then beginning from a higher level of leverage to lateral over. They're trying to do too many things at once, and they've got too many lesser goals, too many competing priorities. So number one, what's the thing to 10x? And if you were to 10x that, would you be willing to let go of some of the other things you're doing to really go big on that one? And if that's the case, yes, that's awesome. That creates more focus, which obviously makes it easier. The other reason why 10x is easier than 2x is because if you were to really 10x a goal, it would force you to pretty much adjust everything you're doing. Your process would fundamentally change because the goal shapes the process. Whereas if you're only going 2x, you're very tempted to continue doing as much as possible of what you're already doing. In other words, you're committed to your past, whereas with 10x, you're committed to your future. With 2x, you're committed to your past. With 10x, you're committed to your future. If you commit to your future, then you've got to change what you were doing in your past. What got you here won't get you there. Whereas if you just go 2x, it's pretty much, how much of my past can I bring with me? How much of my old process can I keep with me? How much of what I was priorly doing can I still keep doing? That is bad for the brain. It's bad for growth, and it plateaus your progress. 10x is easier as well because bigger goals are more motivating. Now, it's important to realize that having a big vision doesn't mean you try to eat the elephant all at once. From a habits and a behavior standpoint, and even from a daily execution standpoint, you actually want to have smaller and smaller goals than you're comfortable with. As an example, if I'm trying to write a book, that might be a big 10x goal, like to write a book and sell 1 million copies as an example. But if I'm actually writing the book on a daily basis, I should make my daily goals smaller and easier than I feel comfortable with. So maybe I know my capability is that I could write 2,000 great words a day, but my goal should actually be just to write 200 words because I know I can do that. I know I can commit to that. And ultimately, when it comes to eating the frog or even eating the elephant one bite at a time, you want to make it so easy, so doable. So you want to like think big but commit small, if that makes sense, or at least commit small on a daily basis, so you can actually be making those investments regularly in your future self. By making investments, I mean actually making progress. If you can actually just jump in and actually write those 200 words, for me, for example, then not only will I get momentum and confidence, but I'll be making progress, which will build my commitment, build my confidence, and over time I'll have bigger and bigger momentum. The problem that most people have is that their high-level goals are too small and their daily goals are too big. So you actually want to reverse that. You want to have massive long-term goals, but small daily goals. You want to have few daily goals, and you want to have them small enough so that you can actually commit to them, knock them out, and do them consistently so that you can create momentum. You can actually do it day by day, make progress. So that's actually a fundamental key. Massive long-term goal, very small daily goals, and few daily goals so that you can actually make regular progress. Most people have the opposite. They've got small long-term goals and they try to accomplish too much in a day, and because they're trying to eat too much of the elephant in one day, often they just don't even try, because there's a million reasons not to just jump in, because they're trying to bite off more than they can chew. One last thought is that small goals are more competitive. Most people, again, don't have a big 10x vision of their future self. Instead, most people are essentially, in psychology world, we call it memetics, but most people want the same thing because of culture. Most people want social media likes. Most people are caught up in the thick of thin things. They're pursuing just getting by rather than becoming wealthy, as an example. Because most people have lower level goals from an evolutionary standpoint, and this is something that Darwin said, he said that the competition is fiercest, where people are trying for the same thing. And once you 10x your goal and start thinking in 10x terms, not only will you be immediately required to become more selective in what you do and let go of your lesser goals, those things that used to be interesting or meaningful or important to you now no longer can be, because you've now committed to a 10x future in one specific area. But also, because you've committed 10x to a certain area, you've now walked away from 95+% of the competition, because most of those people are just certainly not thinking in those realms. And so now that you're thinking in those realms, you can start learning from those, learning at that level, acting at that level, and finding processes at that level, which will then take your life in a totally different direction than the average normal way of doing things. So I hope that helps when it comes to how to start imagining and start thinking 10x. Which area would you want to 10x is the first question to ask. And if you were to prioritize which area to go 10x, once you actually recognize your highest priority, you've got to then ask yourself, are you willing to let go of the other things you're doing right now in order to go big in this one, maybe two areas max? And that's it. What is your next big leap? That's my question for you. There's also another great question as you're pondering that, and I highly recommend you take out your journal and you really journal on your big leap. I'm going to walk you through a process in this video of clarifying and specifying that big leap. But before we even jump into that, one thing I highly recommend you do is to clarify your former big leaps. What were the experiences that you had that got you to this point? They could be actions taken, such as quitting a job you hated. It could be reading a book that completely changed your perspective and your trajectory. So we've all had many big leaps in the past, big and small leaps. But you can scale back and look at all of your last big leaps and say, this is how I was operating, and then I had this experience, or I learned this skill, and all of a sudden now I was making 3 times as much money, or I had a better situation, or I had a better mindset. There's a great quote from Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. He said, a mind that is stretched by a new experience can never go back. Once you've gone through a big leap, you really can't and you shouldn't go back, because you've upgraded at the subconscious level. And so we've all had many different big leaps. When I was a first-year PhD student, I had a massive big leap. I started studying entrepreneurship. I started investing money into my goals. I wanted to become a professional writer. I started investing money in getting knowledge and education. And then I started writing tons of blog posts. I woke up really early and I went through this big leap. And a big aspect of making a big leap is that your mindset and your identity transform. You really get locked into, you start to believe in your future self, and you stop operating as your former self. You stop operating how you used to, and you really get locked in to this new identity, this new level of confidence, this new level of capability. I love studying professional runners, and studying how they had the experiences that ultimately led them to committing to becoming Olympians. Because there are so many people with the talent or the capability to transform into Olympians. You actually have to transform. It's not innate talent, it's that you've gone through several iterative transformations that ultimately lead you to committing to that quest, to committing to that identity, because going through that process of committing to that level of mastery and excellence takes transformational experiences. It takes peak experiences. It takes those experiences where you're like, okay, I actually can do this. I'm going to commit to doing this. And once you commit to actually going to a higher level, Dan Sullivan has a little book on this. He calls it the 4 C's formula. But once you commit 100% to this new level, then you've got to go through this complete change in process. That's going to lead you to courage, which is trying things that haven't worked in the past or that you would never try in the past. What got you here won't get you there. In order to go from here to here, you have to change your process. You can't just do things the way you used to do things. Insanity is doing things the same way and expecting different results. No, when you commit to your new future self, when you commit to a big leap, part of that commitment is what psychologists would call pathways thinking, where you've now got to find different pathways, different process, different mindset, different identity. But anyone who's willing to make big leaps, they have experiences which then make them, first off, believe it's possible, and then they commit to it, and then they go through a literal transformation where they become a new version of themselves, where they go through a process where their identity changes. They now see themselves as their future self. They commit to a new way of doing things. Maybe that changes your entire nutrition, as an example. It's interesting to watch professional runners where they totally looked like normal people, like had average bodies, and then all of a sudden they really committed to a different way of eating and performing and recovering and getting training, and their bodies completely transform. Anyone can do that, but it takes locking in to that future self, and it takes going through the big leap process. So one thing I recommend you do in the beginning, pull out your journal and reflect on your former big leaps. What were the experiences that ultimately allowed you to get to where you're at? Because right now, your current self is different from your former self. Hopefully very different. As Elaine Day Button said, if you're not embarrassed by who you were 12 months ago, you didn't learn enough. Hopefully you now see things and can do things that your former self didn't do. Hopefully you've got mindset, skills, maybe a team. Maybe you've got resources that your former self simply didn't have. There's a great theory in psychology called the self-expansion model. And basically what the self-expansion model shows is that human beings are fundamentally adaptive. When you change any system, you change the whole. When you change a part, you change the whole. And human beings are systems. Not only do we have an internal system, but we also have an external system. Your external system is your environment, your peer group, maybe your team. It also includes your belief system. If you've read a new book or if you're engaging in new experiences, you're changing your system, just like you would change your system on an iPhone. You'd update it, you'd improve it. But also you update your external system. So you change your system all the time, and when you change the system, you change the whole. When you change a part, you change the whole. And so human beings are flexible, we're transformable, and what the self-expansion model shows is that as you have new experiences, as you engage in new relationships, you actually become a new person. You begin to adapt the other people's mindsets, their beliefs, their tools to you. So as you start maybe having mentorships or building a team, whatever you end up doing in terms of developing new relationships, new systems, even just watching videos on YouTube, you start to develop the belief system of the people you watch. And so you transform internally and externally, and you're no longer the same person you were in the past. That's the self-expansion model. And so as you go through a big leap, you become a new version of yourself. So take the time to journal and reflect on what were your past big leaps that got you to where you're at, and the ways in which you're different from your former self. What are the things that your former self used to believe, or what are the habits or the constraints that your former self used to have that you no longer have? What are the ways in which you now do things differently in terms of how you see things, how you solve problems, how you handle things? One of the big leaps that I had was writing a book called Who Not How with Dan Sullivan. Who Not How is the idea that rather than asking how do I accomplish this, you ask who can help me do this. And once I started applying Who Not How to all levels of my life, all of a sudden I had way more freedom and confidence. I could get people who were more skilled at me. For example, filming and editing these YouTube videos. For 4 or 5 years, I wanted to make a YouTube channel, but I didn't do it because I was operating by how. I didn't know how to edit videos. But once I started asking who can do this for me, I could easily find an editor or someone who handles my YouTube channel. And they could do it for me, and I could just do the part that I wanted, and now all of a sudden I have their skills, their capabilities. So now all of a sudden my system is completely different. I'm now operating with a different mindset and system than my former self had, therefore I can get new results than my former self could. So once you've thought about your former big leaps, it's really time for you to conceptualize what is your future big leap? What is your next big leap? What is the 10x upgrade that you want? Your future self. Where is your future self? And let's call it 12 months to 36 months, 1 to 3 years. It could be somewhere in that time frame. It should be big enough that it reflects what psychologists call high hard goals. It shouldn't be like something you could accomplish in 2 days. It's like, what is something in the next 12 to 36 months that you could get to, that you would be in a totally different place? It might be a 10x upgrade. I love the quote from Dan Sullivan that 10x is easier than 2x. Going 10 times bigger is easier than 2 times, because if you're willing to have a 10x vision, it requires you to think fundamentally different than how you are right now. If you just have a 2x goal, meaning you want to grow 2x, you actually generally operate under the same assumptions, and you continue to do things that would stop you. But if you go 10x, then it forces you to stop most of what you're doing and really clarify, what do I want? How am I going to get there? And you have to stop doing like 80% of what you're doing and focus purely on the things that will get you to where you want to go. Going 10x is easier than going 2x. I love it. And so I want you to clarify, and you have to specify and make it measurable. What is your future condition that you want that's 10x better, that's going to require a big leap to getting there? You've got to clarify the vision first. What is your vision towards your future self? Where do you want to be in 1 to 3 years, where if you got there, you'd have a completely different situation. You'd be on a different platform. You'd have different capability, different freedom, different opportunities. It's just visualizing your next big step, your next big move, your next big breakaway. What is that? What is your next big leap? Who is your future self at 10x where you're at currently in terms of their freedom, maybe in terms of their mindset, in terms of their confidence, in terms of their income? Whatever it is, you've got to clarify the metrics of your future self. As for myself, my big leap is over the next 2 years. So I recently signed a 4-book contract with Hay House, which is my publisher. And so over the next 2.5 years, I actually have 5 books coming out. But by October of 2023, I will have many more books out. So I've got 1 book coming out this year, which is 2021. But in 2022 and in 2023, I've got 2 books each coming out. And so by October of 2023, I will have 8 published books out. So I have about a little over 2 years to make a big leap. And I can make a big leap in specific ways, not just books, my YouTube channel, my business, my health, my family. And so I am very much specifying where I want to be. And I do want to be 10x where I'm at in various categories, because I know that if I can get there, holy cow, my freedom, my confidence, my ability to move forward will be so much beyond my current self. This brings up another interesting and important point, is that human beings have contextual agency. Our agency as people, which is our ability to act and make choices, it's actually based on our context. And that's actually another thing that the self-expansion model says. Once you develop new relationships, you now have a new context. You have people in your context or part of your system that are different from your former self. And so your ability to act and to make choices is based on your context. If you were living like 200 years ago, you wouldn't be able to just jump on an airplane. Airplanes are part of our context. You wouldn't have the internet. You wouldn't have your smartphone. Well, the same is true of your future self. Your future self is in a different context than your current self. Therefore, they have different agency. They have different abilities, different capabilities, different choices, different options, different freedoms than your current self. And so you want to specify those. Specify the context of your future self. And then from there, once you've specified it and made it measurable and clear, then you start to develop the pathway to getting there. That's the big leap. The big leap is first off visualizing and clarifying where you want to go, and then going through the transformative process. Deliberate practice is how you transform. Deliberate practice is the concept in psychology. A lot of people call it the 10,000 hour rule. But a core point of it is that you actually can transform your knowledge, your skills, and your abilities. You can go from someone who's poor at something, such as money, to someone who's excellent at it. You can go from someone who's making very little money to someone who's making a lot of money. You can go from someone who's not an entrepreneur to someone who's leading an amazing team. You can go from someone who's terrible at golf to someone who's amazing at golf. You can go from someone who doesn't speak Spanish to someone who's fluent in Spanish. You can transform through practice, through visualizing where you want to be, and through undergoing a process of getting there, through failing, through trial and error, through investing in your future self, through taking action, through courage, through becoming flexible. You can transform as a person, and it's fundamental that you do transform. It's healthy that you transform. The more you can transform yourself, the more peak experiences you have, the more happy you'll be, the more confident you'll be. Another crucial aspect of all of this is what Dan Sullivan would call the gain and the gap. And that's where you stop measuring yourself against other people and you stop measuring yourself against your ideal. And instead you measure yourself against where you were before. Dan and I actually wrote a book on this called The Gap and the Gain, and it comes out in October. It's going to be a game changer. But don't measure yourself against anyone else. Measure yourself against your former self. Measure yourself against where you were before. So as you're taking leaps, as you're taking action, as you're improving your process, as you're investing in education, as you're going through the transformative process, you measure yourself against where you were 3 months ago, 6 months ago, 12 months ago, and you see your gains. And then as you see your gains, you're going to want to create more gains, because how you see anything is how you see everything. Psychologists call that selective attention. We train our worldviews. And so whatever you measure and whatever you focus on, you start to see more of. And so if you start focusing on your gains and your own progress, then you're going to start wanting more gains, because you can transform your desires. Whatever you do, you want more of. All behavior is addictive. So if you eat donuts, you're going to want more donuts. If you scroll on Facebook, you're going to want to scroll more on Facebook. If you wake up at 5 in the morning and go to the gym, you're going to want to do that more and more. All behavior is addictive. And so when you start measuring your own progress, you become what psychologists call self-determined, where you now are using yourself as the measuring stick rather than using someone else. That allows you to get off the hedonic treadmill. That allows you to stop comparing and competing with other people, and that allows you to actually become intrinsically motivated. And the more you start measuring gains, the more you'll start seeing gains. The more you start seeing gains, the more you'll start wanting gains. And this will lead you to using your behavior a lot more effectively, using your time more effectively, taking bigger leaps. And eventually you can get where you want to go. You can make big leaps. You have already made big leaps. The important thing for you to question right now is, what is your next big leap? Where are you going to be in 1, 2, or 3 years? Is the transformation going to be mind-blowing? Is it going to be so mind-blowing that a lot of people around you won't even believe it? Is this a breakaway? Like in endurance sports, some athletes break away. They break away from the pack and they go on a sprint towards the run. Are you going to make your breakaway? An important part of all of this as well is that as you're going through a big leap, your process obviously has to change. You have to find new and better pathways, because insanity is doing the same thing and expecting a different result. What got you here won't get you there. So as you visualize a new future self, you've got to now train yourself in finding new and better pathways to getting there. But part of that is not only improving your output, but improving your recovery, improving your process, improving how you do things in a sustainable way, sustainable towards that vision. It's going to look very different from your former process. And it shouldn't matter to you what anyone else thinks about your future self. What is your next big leap? Where are you going to go? What's your breakaway? What's your transformation going to be over these next 1 to 3 years? How far can you go? Measure your own progress. Don't worry about what anyone else thinks. Don't measure your progress against anyone else. Become self-determined. Right now, I'm going to tell you why most personality tests are complete junk science. If you want to change your life in any specific way, you need to start by changing your identity. Your identity is the first place to start, but for most people, they actually try to change their behavior without changing their identity. And when you're trying to behave in certain ways, for example, if you're trying to eat healthy, but you have the identity of an overweight person, then what you're doing is you're trying to exercise willpower. You're trying to essentially behave outside of the way you see yourself, and that's a losing battle. If you're going to try to eat healthy, but ultimately you identify as someone who's overweight, or you identify with someone who loves eating junk food, then you're going to exercise all sorts of willpower and you're going to always fail. Your behavior is going to always fall to the level of your identity. And so the first place you want to start is by changing your identity. You need to define out your future self. There's a lot of research in positive psychology that shows you want to define out your best possible self. 5 to 10 years into the future, you can really choose any timeline, but you start with your future self, because then that becomes the basis of your current identity. And then you use your future self as the basis of your new identity. You start telling people about your future self. You start acting as your future self. And over time, it becomes habituated. It becomes who you are. But it is a process. The easiest way to ultimately do it is first define out your future self, write it in your journal, then tell people who you want your future self to be, and stop overly identifying with your current self. Once you start telling people about your future self, and as you start to build an environment around your future self, you start to have accountability partners, you start investing money in coaches, mentors, you start removing the people in your life that really want you to stay your former self. As you start doing this, your behavior will slowly integrate. Your behavior will slowly come. You don't have to be so hard on yourself. The goal is not perfection. The goal is that your average behavior over time improves. So for example, if you look at your life over the last like month, let's just say the last month, did the last month's behavior look more like your future self than the one before? So you don't need to be perfect on a daily basis. It's more like, on average, are you starting to see your future self show up? Are you starting to see evidence of your future self? But you got to start with your identity. And in this video, I'm going to talk about one of the things that ultimately caps or limits your identity, and that's personality tests. Those tests actually are one of the worst things you can do for your identity. Those tests create what Carol Dweck would call a fixed mindset. They also create psychological rigidity, where if you have a locked-in identity, then you're very rigid. If you think you're an introvert, for example, then you're very rigid. You're not willing to do things that maybe someone who is extroverted would do. You put very tight constraints around what you can do, and you say, I can't do that. You create a really heavy box around yourself. That's why people like to label themselves, honestly. Labels create a box, and they stop you from being flexible outside that box. And there's a lot of research ultimately that shows that psychological flexibility is the fundamental way to learn. You've got to be willing to step outside that box, face uncertainty. It takes courage and commitment to step outside that box, but you want to become increasingly flexible with uncertainty, flexible in new situations. And ultimately then, as you do that, you build extreme confidence. And as you build more confidence, you stop overly defining your current self. By the way, down below is access to a free peak state checklist. It's a morning routine checklist that's been downloaded literally over 800,000 times. You can click the link, get access to that, and also please click the thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Right now, I'm going to tell you why most personality tests are complete junk science. First things first, I'll start with the one personality test that is not junk science, and that's the Big Five. There's a test called the Big Five Personality Factors. It's the one that psychologists actually use. It's been psychologically validated, and it has 5 factors. And I'm off the top of my head, we'll see if I can get all those, but there's extroversion, there's openness to new experiences, there's neuroticism, there's conscientiousness, and then there's agreeableness. So all of those are just aspects of personality. And how that test works is you take the test and it gives you a score on like a percentile rank. A percentile rank means that there's usually like a bell curve, and the bell curve means that most people are going to be in the middle, and then there's going to be some outliers on the edges. So you may actually be an outlier when it comes to extroversion. You may have way high extroversion, or you may have way low extroversion, meaning that you're more introverted. But what the research shows on the Big Five is that these things are flexible and adaptive. Actually, these things change over your life way more than you expect they would. Like, there's longitudinal research where they study people at age 14, and then they study those same people on these types of factors in like their 70s, and there's no correlation. Like, they're totally different people. There's also research that shows that you can proactively change any of these. If you want to become more conscientious, which is more organized and more goal-oriented, you can do that. You can also become more emotionally intelligent, which is the opposite of being neurotic. So if you are emotionally neurotic and you get thrown off and you're rigid emotionally and stuff like that, you can obviously develop your emotions. You can become a lot more emotionally centered. You can learn how to emotionally regulate. You can also become more extroverted. And there's a lot of research that shows that optimistic and extroverted people actually live a lot longer. And so extroversion and introversion, the goal is actually that you don't overly identify with any of these things. You actually just set goals, and then you use your goals as the basis for your personality. So whatever your future self is, whoever it is you want to be, you then use that as the basis for who you become. So if you ultimately have the goal of becoming a good public speaker, or if you have the goal of becoming really good with money, you use your view of your future self and you use your goals as the basis for the personality you develop. The problem for most people is that they do the opposite. They overly define their current personality, and then they set goals that they think fit their personality. So in other words, they are fitting their view of their future based on the rigid and very boxed in view of themselves. And that's what people are taught to do. They're taught to find themselves, figure out who you are, go find yourself, and if you need to, use one of the trendy personality tests. And once you've found and discovered yourself, then just be true to that self. And don't do anything outside of your strengths or weaknesses, or don't do anything outside of your natural strengths. Discover yourself, and then you can set the goals and live the life that's within that box, within your comfort zone. That's a very shallow way of living. There's a great book called So Good They Can't Ignore You by Cal Newport, and one of the things he talks about is the myths of trying to find your passion. Instead of trying to find your passion, which is a very self-obsessed view, what you want to do instead is you want to identify rare and valuable skills in the marketplace, and then you want to develop those rare and valuable skills. And as you develop those rare and valuable skills, passion will follow. So what most people think is that passion is the starting point. Instead of passion being the starting point, passion ends up being an organic byproduct. When you just develop rare and valuable skills, once you get really good at something, you become passionate about it. And so the same is true of your personality. Rather than trying to have personality at the front end, you actually define who you want to be, and then your personality develops, just like passion develops. You decide who you want to be. But ultimately, here are the reasons why most personality tests are garbage. And these are all tests outside of the Big Five. And by the way, the Big Five would never give you a label. So for example, the Myers-Briggs test has 16 types. According to research in psychology, there's no such thing as a personality type. Personality types, like that is not how human beings work. Human beings are a lot more situational, a lot more contextual. For example, I might be more extroverted around certain types of people, or at certain times of the day, or in certain environments. Whereas in other situations or in other periods of time, I may be more introverted. And so situation really matters, context matters. And what's funny is that the type-based personality test, they give you an identity, they give you a label, they give you a type, and then they assume that that's who you always are. That commits what psychologists would call the fundamental attribution error. The fundamental attribution error is assuming that people act because of purely their character or their personality, rather than the fact that they're acting the way that they do because of situational factors. So for example, if someone cuts you off on the road and they're speeding, you commit the fundamental attribution error if you say, that is just a bad person who fast drives. Whereas if you got to understand their context better, if you got to understand their situation better, you'd maybe understand why they're speeding in the moment. So situations really matter. Situations shape people, situations shape your behavior. And so you can't ignore the power of situation. And one of the things that type-based personality tests like Myers-Briggs do is that they give you a score and they assume that you're always going to be that same person, which is hugely naive. It's ridiculous. Let me just say from the beginning, any test that gives you a type, so this is the Myers-Briggs, the Enneagram, color code, DISC, anything that gives you a type and sticks you in a broad category and assumes that you're always going to fit that category is junk science. Myers-Briggs is junk science, Enneagram is junk science, color code, DISC, all of those tests are junk science. Can you get some good information out of those tests? Sure, probably. But the problem with those tests is a few-fold. One is first off, they give you a label and they assume that that label is always true. Research shows that that's not the case. Actually, when you overly adopt a label, you end up becoming very mindless. That's what Ellen Langer calls it. She's a Harvard psychologist. When you adopt a label, labels create tunnel vision, and tunnel vision is what you focus on. It creates what is called inattentional blindness, where you're not aware of what's going on around you because you're so focused on one thing. So if I think I'm depressed, and I've labeled myself as depressed, or if I think I'm an introvert, then I will be blind to all of the times when I'm actually acting outside the label. In other words, I'll be mindless. And so labels create mindlessness. They also create psychological rigidity or emotional rigidity. You've created such a box around your identity that you stop being flexible to situations outside of that identity. So if you've defined yourself as depressed, or if you've defined yourself as an introvert, then you're going to be very emotionally inflexible. You're not going to even try because you're not going to act in ways outside of your label, or you're going to try not to. You're going to handicap yourself. And so you become very rigid, which stops you from learning. Another thing that it stops you from doing is it stops you from imagining a future self that has attributes that are different from this label. So if you've really taken on one of these tests, this Myers-Briggs, this Enneagram, and you've really given yourself some labels, you're really building all sorts of walls around your current identity and your current self. And essentially what you're doing is you're creating limitations. I think that's what Jim Quick said. He said, labels create limitations. And so you've really boxed in yourself as far as who I am and what I can do. And that obviously shatters, or it limits, it blocks your imagination towards imagining your best future self, or your future self as someone with a different aspect and different characteristics. So not only does it create emotional rigidity and mindlessness and inattentional blindness, but it also stops you from imagining your best possible self as someone totally different. And as I've already said, there's a lot of research that shows if you want to boost your optimism, you want to imagine your best possible self. Also, if you want to engage in what psychologists call deliberate practice, which is how you develop mastery and skills, you need to have imagination. You need to imagine your future self. You need to have clear goals, and you need to see your future self with skills, abilities, attributes, and characteristics that are way beyond your current self. You have to see that, and then you need to ultimately get training and coaching and go through the process of going from where you are to where you want to be. But if you have high levels of imagination, and then if you're willing to go through the learning process of going from here to there, you can change. That's what all the research shows. If you set clear goals, you can change your personality, but also you can become your desired future self. You do that through deliberate practice. You do that through coaching and training. You do that by changing your identity and then ultimately changing your behavior, changing the system around you, and then over time, you start to see yourself as who you imagine yourself to be, and your results start to show. And you can do that in any area of your life. You can do that with money. You can go from someone who is broke to someone who sees themselves as wealthy, and then you ultimately study, train, get mentors, get training, and ultimately then you become to see yourself as that person. You behave as that person, and all of a sudden it becomes your new normal. You can do that with any goal, with fitness, with relationships. You can be someone who's not very good at relationships to someone who's amazing at relationships. But you have to first start with imagination. And even Albert Einstein himself said that imagination is more important than knowledge. But the primary personality tests out there that give you a label ultimately shatter and stop you from having an imagination. And what you do is you've just built huge walls around yourself and what's possible to you. You've become mindless. You've stunted your imagination. And then you just create a fixed mindset for yourself. And so that's ultimately the end of it, is that personality tests create a fixed mindset. And you really don't need them. I'll tell you, they really don't help. The thing that you would want more than personality tests, even the Big Five, I find that the Big Five isn't really that useful. I've taken it. I've even let my kids take it. We get their percentile scores. There's obviously a lot of problems with taking personality tests. There's a lot of research that shows that the environment you're in when you take the test determines in a lot of ways how you take it. For example, there was a study that broke the participants into two groups. One of the groups took a personality test, and then they took the same personality test 2 weeks later. Their scores were pretty similar. 2 weeks isn't very far apart. If you take a test and you take it a year later, you're going to get different scores. But in this case, group one, they took the test. A few weeks later, they took it again and got similar scores. But here's the thing. In that case, there was someone who gave them the personality test. There was someone who distributed the personality test. And in that case, the same person distributed it at time 1 and at time 2 a few weeks later. Well, the group 2 took the same test, and then a few weeks later, they took the same time interval, they took the test again. The only difference was that there was a different test administrator. At time 1, someone gave them the test, and at time 2, a different person gave them the test. And just by having someone give them the test that was a different administrator, the scores were non-correlated. In other words, they answered the questions really differently based on who gave them the test. And there's a lot of research that shows that your mindset when you take the test, your emotions, or the reasons why you take the test heavily determine why you take the test. And so these scores aren't really that reliable anyways. Here's what you're much better off doing. Define your future self, and then use your journal regularly to write out your goals and to regulate your emotions. When you're going through highs and lows, you end up writing about your struggles, writing about your goals, writing about your thoughts, getting really self-aware through journaling, but also using your journal as a tool for self-creation. Also having people around you who support and help you with your goals. Just as one example for myself, I have a financial advisor. He's someone who helps me clarify my future self. Just as an example, a few years ago, I did not necessarily identify with someone who was really good with money. I had aspirations to become good with money, but I didn't fully identify with someone who's good at money. I now currently, my current self compared to my former self, I really identify as someone who's much better with money than my former self did. But a lot of that has to do with the fact that I've got this financial advisor and other mentors who really teach and train me how to think about money, but also train me to think even better about money and have a bigger view of my future self than my current self. And so I now make much better decisions, but I also have a much better environment and system around me, much better people around me to support me and to encourage me to even expand my view of my future self further, to expand my view of what's possible for me. That is actually a theory in psychology called the self-expansion model. According to the self-expansion model, no person is a floating entity that's unimpacted by other things. We're not just self-contained entities. We are very much relational beings that are impacted by the people we're in a relationship with. And your potential as a person is influenced by the people that you're in a relationship with. For example, I have 3 kids who we adopted from the foster system. You know, they had very limited potential and very limited views of their future when they were living with their biological parents who were high on drugs and not taking them to school. They didn't have a lot of resources to put towards their goals. And that, as human beings, is what shapes our potential, is the resources we have towards our goals, the help we have towards those goals. And those resources are not just financial, but they could be knowledge, encouragement, support. And so, for example, back to my financial advisor, I get a lot of resources, not just in terms of knowledge or opportunities or perspectives, but in terms of encouragement. he has views way beyond what I have. And so he can help me expand my views of what's possible for me. And that's why it's called the self-expansion model, is because as people, we either expand or constrict based on who we're in a relationship with, because who we're in a relationship with determines the resources we have, knowledge, attention, even money, or experiences or connections that then help us feel what we can do for our future selves. So here's my advice. Don't worry about personality tests. They're junk. Anyone who's pitching these types of personality tests that throw you into a category, it's junk science. It's not how people work. People are not a single label that is uninfluenced by circumstance or context. Overly taking on a label obsesses you with your current self, and then it boxes your future self and it leads you to being mindless. It leads you to being very inflexible. It leads you to stop pursuing goals that are outside your future self. It stunts your imagination towards your future self. Personality tests are junk. Instead, you create your future self, and then you use your journal and an improving network of people to help you become the person you want to be, to grow out of your former self, and to continually expand what you see as possible for yourself, and to continually update your identity. You want your identity to be very flexible so that you're continually improving and adjusting yourself, so that as you look back on your former self, you're not the person you used to be. As the British philosopher Elaine de Botton said, anyone who's not embarrassed by who they were 12 months ago didn't learn enough. As you grow, as you set future self goals, and then as you go through the deliberate practice process, as you use your journal and your improving network to ultimately adapt and refine your behavior, your habits, and things like that, then you transform so much that as you look back on your former self, you're blown away by how much you grew. And you can then apply what Dan Sullivan calls the gap in the gain, where as you're pursuing big goals, you're always measuring your current self against your former self, and you're recognizing more and more how much you've transformed. That then gives you confidence and motivation because you're seeing progress and you're appreciating the improvements you make. So forget about the personality tests. Instead, you define who your future self is, and then you become more psychologically flexible. You become better at regulating your emotions, and you increase your network around you that helps you expand as a person. In this video, I'm going to share with you the best example of someone I've seen who's measured their own progress. It's actually James Clear, the author of Atomic Habits. On his blog every year for the last several years, he's created annual reviews, and he's been very explicit about his measurements. Again, if you're not measuring, you can't manage it, and James Clear has become one of the most successful authors over the last 5-10 years, and I'm going to show you his annual review process is one of the most amazing ways that he's been able to measure and track his own progress forward, and I heavily recommend you do this. I'm also going to start really quickly with a story, why you should do this. So one of my friends, Jill, she is a physical therapist at an elementary school for children with challenges like Down syndrome, like disabled kids who have a really hard time learning and stuff like that. Jill works with these kids one-on-one, and they set goals, and it's obviously difficult work. A lot of times they make seemingly no progress. Like, these kids are really hard to make progress on. And recently, Jill was actually looking at one of her annual reviews. Every year, at the end of the year, she writes about the goals that they're setting, the progress. She actually tracks a lot of things throughout the year. But with one of the little girls that she is working with, she took some time to just look back on the progress report from last year. And one of the things that she noticed is that last year at this time, this little girl, they were working on her walking on grass. This little girl couldn't walk on grass or uneven surfaces. It was just too hard for her, too intimidating. And it was powerful for Jill to read that, because that's actually challenges that this little girl and Jill have overcome a long time ago, but Jill had completely forgotten about it. And so by going back and reviewing her progress and reviewing what they were working on last year, she was reminded of what they were actually doing, which it's so easy to forget. It's so easy to forget what you were doing last year, because as people, we're very focused on what's in front of us. We're focused on our future. It's easy to forget or even downplay your own progress. And there's reasons why you should not only record your progress, it helps your memory, but review your progress regularly, because by reviewing your progress, like Jill just did, you're reminded of what you were focused on maybe 1 year ago, 5-10 years ago. And by seeing the things that you've probably forgotten, you probably forget the things that you were working on 2-3 years ago. You forget how challenging it was. So the thing about this is that really your memory is always being reconstructed in the present. If you have new experiences, you learn things, you quickly slow boil and adapt to your new views, your new circumstances, and from the present, you view the past. We always reconstruct the past in our memories based on where we're at in the present, and so your memories are actually always changing based on where you're at right now in the present. And so it can be really easy to forget where you actually were. Just as an example, like I was reading one of my old journals when I was writing this book, actually, Willpower Doesn't Work. And I remembered how difficult this was. I actually, according to my actual memory, when I'm not actually reviewing the progress, I actually thought it was easy. But I went back and I was reading some of my old journals and I realized, whoa, it was a lot harder than I remember it being. And so you want to take time to look back because it does a few things. First off, it builds hope, it builds confidence. It helps you really appreciate where you're at right now. And appreciating where you're at right now is obviously super important for being mindful, happy, joyful. This is just a strategy not only for building your confidence, your hope, but it does bring you happiness. Feeling progress makes you happy. Seeing progress makes you happy. It also builds your confidence. There's a lot of research that shows that your confidence is actually the byproduct of former progress, former success. And so by taking the time to look at your former progress, by taking the time to actually celebrate your wins, your confidence is going to skyrocket. And there's actually a lot of research on this. BJ Fogg talks about the importance of celebration. Taking the time to look back at where you were before, being blown away at the progress you've made and stuff that you've actually forgotten. That gives you celebration, it gives you confidence, it gives you hope. And that's a lot of the things that happened for Jill. When she was looking at this girl's report and seeing and remembering what they were actually working on a year ago and realizing that they are completely past that. They're working on new challenges and remembering, wow, this little girl used to struggle walking on grass. It was just too intimidating for her, and now she can totally do that. That also gave her a lot of pride and made her proud of this little girl and made her love her more, and it gave her motivation to do her work. One of the things you want to do when you're measuring back on your progress, it actually gives you motivation, grit, and resilience. For Jill and for other people, there's actually a lot of research that shows that teachers or therapists that work with high needs kids, they have huge burnout rates and they quit their jobs a lot faster than normal teachers because it can just feel like really tedious work. And it can be demotivating if you're not seeing progress. But Jill, she's incredibly motivated, incredibly passionate about her work because she regularly takes time to reference back on the progress and she regularly sees those wins. She regularly sees progress. This first off allows her to appreciate her little kids more because she can actually see their own progress rather than just measuring them against where she hopes that they are in the future. So taking time to measure your progress is huge for your resilience. It helps you push through. It helps remind you that you can accomplish hard things because if you're pursuing big goals, and by the way, the research is pretty clear on this, you want to have really high and hard goals. You want to have big goals. You want to be taking on mountains. But as you're climbing those steps, you want to regularly review your progress. This is what Dan Sullivan calls measuring the gain rather than the gap. You're going to want big goals. Big goals are the most motivating goals. But if you're always measuring yourself against some ideal in your future, then you're always going to be depressed. Again, that's what Dan Sullivan calls measuring the gap. You have clear goals, but as you make progress, you measure the gains. That gives you resilience, faith, hope, confidence that you can keep going, and it actually boosts your motivation to keep going. So now I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I'm going to show you some of James Clear's annual reviews. And my reason for doing this is just to show you how thorough he's been and to provide you an example that you can maybe use for yourself. Maybe you can start reviewing your progress or creating some way of reviewing your progress every week, every month, every year. And then you can review it on a regular basis just to catch back up with your former self and to see how much you've changed. Because the truth is you're not your former self. You're not the same person you used to be. You're not measuring success the same way. You've defined success differently. You live in a different world than your former self. What's normal for you right now may have been the dreams for your former self. And the same is true of your future self. What's going to be normal for your future self is the dreams of your current self. And you're going to eventually slow boil into that, and then you're going to forget how far you've actually come. So here's James Clear's page of his annual reviews. If you just go to jamesclear.com/annual review, and down below is a link to that. This is how he frames his annual reviews. Each year I write an annual review, which I share publicly. My annual reviews answers these questions. What went well this year? What didn't go so well? What am I working on right now? He actually, for some reason, didn't actually make one for 2020, it looks like. But I'm just going to show you some of these because it's so powerful. So he talks about what went well, writing. After years of inconsistency, this is the year I finally turned it around. I wrote a new article every Monday and Thursday. So this is when he first started blogging. He said, my first article was published in 2012. I'm proud to say that since then I've published 114 articles on my website, and I have 686,000 unique visitors. He's got 40,000 people on his newsletter at this time, and this was back at the end of 2013. He talks about traveling, weightlifting. These are his best lifts. He's got his snatch, his squat, his bench press. And then he talks about what didn't go well. Creating products. He wanted to create products. He wasn't that great at delegating. He wasn't that great at staying in touch with his family. And then he talks about what he's looking forward to. So I'm going to go out now and I want to just show you some progress he's made. So at the end of 2013, he had 40,000 subscribers. His website had like 600,000 unique visitors. Well, let's go to 2014. Same model, what went well, what didn't go well. He said his writing went really well. He published new articles. His now website has 2.4 million visitors just that 1 year. His email subscribers are now in the hundreds of thousands. So that's pretty powerful. And now he's kind of measuring it even a lot smoother. He published 88 new articles that year. He got 70,000 new email subscribers. His website got that many visitors. Again, I want to tell you, the clarity of his measurement. You cannot improve or manage what you're not measuring. It's obvious that James Clear was measuring how many articles he was writing, how many views those articles got, how many email subscribers he was getting. He was really clear on what he was measuring, and that allowed him to make progress on his goals. So he talked about just his success in his traveling. He measured how many countries he went to, how many states. Again, here is his measurement for how many workouts he had. He worked out 7 times in January. So he was tracking the heck out of the things that mattered to him. So my question for you is, as you're looking at James Clear's annual reviews, first off, what are you measuring? Are you specifically measuring anything towards your future self, towards your goals? And are you taking time regularly to review your measurements and make sure you're actually making the progress you want? If you're not measuring it, you can't manage it. But if you're measuring it, it will improve. And if you're measuring and reporting it, as Pearson's Law says, it will improve exponentially. So now I'm going to pop out here. I'm just going to show you 2015. We're just going to keep cruising through. So what went well this year? He got married. He got a book deal. He said in his 2014 review that one of his goals for 2015 was to turn pro as a writer, which for him meant getting a book deal. So this year he got a book deal. Here's how his writing went that year. He wrote 74 new articles. He got 150,000 new subscribers, which took him up to 200,000. His blog got almost 6 million unique visitors. And so now at that point in time, he had almost 9 million visitors since he launched it. Here's his strength training numbers. Here's his travel numbers. He talks about other things that he learned. He talks about what didn't go well. He talks about things that he was challenged on, the hamster wheel it looks like. So I'm just going to keep cruising through this because it's very fascinating. So what went well? He started hiring. He got an executive assistant. His business started to grow. He didn't write as many articles, but you can tell his focus was shifting. He was writing that book. So he got 200,000 new subscribers. His subscribers were now up almost to 400,000. Now his website is just getting insane views. And so again, what you measure improves. And so at this point, he was probably focused on writing his book. His travel's killing it. His weightlifting is improving. What didn't go well? He actually talks about the challenge of writing his book. And so it's just really interesting. This is a great model. I'm just going to finish one more time. I'm going to just look at the 2019 review. What went well this year? Book sales. So at that point, his book Atomic Habits actually had come out. He sold over 1.3 million copies in 2019, 12 consecutive months on the New York Times bestseller list. He's got all of these reviews. He's got all of these ratings. He's now speaking all over the world. He's got this new newsletter. He's got this huge audience growth. He wrote 5 articles in 2019. He got almost 400,000 new email subscribers. He's got like 600,000 email subscribers. His blog's been read 50 million times. And then he obviously has his other metrics of what he's going for. And there's some really important things to consider here. Number one, if you're still measuring the same things you were measuring like 5-7 years ago, that may be a question. One of the things I like about James Clear is that his current self is measuring slightly different things. Some of the things, he's still measuring some of the things he was measuring 5 years ago, but now he's measuring book sales, he's measuring speaking gigs, he's measuring things his former self wasn't measuring, and there's levels. There's actually a concept called a maturity model, and a maturity model is how a business knows if it's growing or whatnot, and at the different levels of the maturity model, there's different things you measure. So you may be at a beginner level, but once you get to an intermediate level, you're measuring different things. You're focused on different things. And then once you get to an advanced level, you're measuring even different things. And so I only share this with you because James Clear is an amazing example of someone who's been measuring the gain. He's been measuring his own progress. He's been public about his measurables. He's been specific about what he's been measuring. He's been explicit and public about what he's been measuring, and he's been improving insanely. His growth curve is very powerful, and I think he's really clear on his own maturity model. And so I invite you to take the time to measure your own progress, whether that be in the form of a journal, a log, annual reviews, monthly reviews, and take the time regularly to look back at where you were before. This is again what Dan would call measuring the gain. If you do this, you'll have a similar experience to what Jill had. Jill, the person who worked with the challenged youth. You'll have moments where you'll be reminded of what your former self was up to and what your former self was working on, and you'll realize how far you came. There's a lot of research on this subject out of Harvard. Daniel Gilbert has written a lot about the differences between your former and your current self and about how you've grown so much. You don't even realize how much you've grown compared to your former self unless you actually took some notes and look back on where you were actually at. You see the world differently. You are pursuing different things. You're measuring different things. You define success differently. And it's really powerful to look back sometimes and realize how much you've grown as a person. Again, the same is true of your future self. Your future self is going to be measuring things that you're not even currently aware of. Let me give an example. When I was 18 years old, I was playing a lot of World of Warcraft. That's what I was measuring. I was measuring how much progress I was making on my character in World of Warcraft. A couple years ago, I was measuring my own email subscriber growth. I was a writer, I was a blogger on Medium.com, and so I was measuring how many views I got on Medium.com and how many subscribers I was getting. Now I'm measuring how my books sell, and I'm measuring my income and my investments and my family. I'm measuring completely different things that my former self wasn't even aware of. My former self wasn't even aware of a lot of the things that now that I'm focused on, I'm measuring, and the same is going to be true of your future self. Right now, you are completely blind and unaware of a lot of the things that are very important to your future self, things that they're going to be measuring, things that they're going to be seeking to improve. And so the more you can visualize your future self and think about what's going to be important to them and what do they want to be visualizing, and then you create a maturity model where you think about how do I get from where I am to where I want to go and what are the different levels between where I'm at and where I want to go, then you can start to plan out a path. And having a path is really important. Research shows that having a path is key for having motivation and having hope. Actually, psychologists call it pathways thinking. You want to have a clear goal or goals, and you want to have a path that's workable, that's adaptive, but that gives you confidence that you're confident can get you there. And that path is the maturity model. It's the maturity model of where you are to where you want to go. And at different stages, there's going to be different things that you're focused on, different things that you're measuring, different things that you're worried about. What got you here won't get you there. James Clear is an amazing example of that. For a long time, at one stage of his maturity model, he was just writing a ton of blog posts. Then he got to a point where writing blog posts wasn't the thing he was focused on that much. Instead, he was writing that book. Then he launched that book, and his goal became to sell a ton of copies of that book and to get speaking gigs and to make tons of money. Now we have no clue what he's measuring because he's not publishing his reviews. But you can see that he was measuring different things and he was focused on different things along his own maturity model. And then he was publishing it and measuring his progress backwards, and he was sharing it publicly, which is really generous and really powerful of him. So that's my challenge to you, is start reviewing your own progress, start documenting your progress, start measuring your progress, the things that matter to you. Chart out the maturity model of your future self, and then become your future self. In the book, Dopamine Nation, Dr. Anna Lempke tells us why people are getting so messed up in the world today. It all has to do with our relationship with dopamine. Dopamine is the reward chemical in our mind that gives us pleasure, but it's also the same chemical that gives us motivation towards big goals. Dopamine basically is the fuel that gives you the motivation to go out and seek big rewards or achieve goals, but it's also the experience you get when you get a reward. And basically, this is what's going on in the world today, is the world that we live in is so instant gratification, so quick release, so easy, that we've created a bad relationship with motivation and with pleasure and rewards. Often when people wake up, the first thing they do is they start checking their social media, and that gives them an immediate dopamine hit. They start watching YouTube videos. They start doing anything to get that quick dopamine hit. They wake up and then they start consuming chemicals that give them stimulants, or they eat food that is high in sugar or in fat. When you give yourself rewards without earning those rewards, without actually having to have worked and done it. As an example, if you go to the gym and work really hard, you can have endorphins and you can have dopamine. You can get feeling good because you earned it, and you can feel confidence. But if you just give yourself instant rewards, instant gratification without having done anything, then you train yourself to think that you can have rewards without earning it. And that really messes up your motivation. It messes up your confidence. So in this video, I'm going to share with you a morning routine that you can apply so that you can constantly master your dopamine. You can master your energy. You can master your emotions. You can master your motivation so that you can become increasingly motivated, increasingly successful, have bigger and longer term goals, and not get so messed up along the way. So I'm Dr. Benjamin Hardy, by the way, author of Be Your Future Self Now. Down below, you can go to futureself.com and get free resources on this book. This book will change your life. With that said, let me go ahead and jump into this morning routine. Before I jump into the specifics of the morning routine, I want to share with you a few psychological principles. One is that if you use motivation as the fuel to achieve big goals, you get a lot of benefits. First off, you get better and better at earning progress. You have the joy of the pursuit, as they would say. It's the pursuit that gives you fuel. When you're someone who starts to get your dopamine right, then you start wanting to wake up and start achieving goals, start making progress towards your goals. And as you work to make progress, not only do you see progress, which is a reward in and of itself, but then you get confidence, because confidence comes from making progress. Confidence comes by having actually completed something, by having made progress. When you look back at a good workout or having actually made progress on your goals, you can look back on that and see massive confidence. There's another concept in psychology, actually. It's called identity capital. And your identity capital is very similar to your confidence. When you accomplish a goal, for example, if I write a book, I now have the identity capital of someone who's written a book, because I can look back and see that I've done it. And so if you wake up and you start making progress towards your goals, if you have a day well spent, a day well lived, you put the important before the urgent. And by the way, we live in a world of seeking urgent first. Urgent could be watching the mainstream news, watching the what's hot, getting on social media. If you're always seeking what's urgent, you're never doing what's important. And so your dopamine gets all out of whack. And if you're always seeking the instant gratification, the immediate things, then what happens is you start creating a lower and lower baseline, because every time you use up your dopamine on an instant gratification, whether it's unhealthy food, whether it's just scrolling social media mindlessly, you're basically burning your dopamine tank down, and you're creating a lower and lower baseline that you're basically setting yourself up for disaster. And so if your dopamine gets all out of whack because you're just constantly seeking short-term rewards, this is basically addiction. Then what happens is if you're not given those instant rewards, then because your baseline is so low, you're now depressed. And so not only have you destroyed motivation, but you've also created a state where you're now depressed unless you are seeking higher and higher dosages of instant, fake, cheap dopamine. So there's cheap dopamine, and then there's genuine dopamine. And the genuine dopamine is the fuel to help you achieve massive goals, which then leads to confidence and increased identity capital. As you boost your identity capital by achieving bigger and bigger goals on a daily basis, you then see yourself as the kind of person who can achieve bigger goals. James Clear, the author of Atomic Habits, said that every behavior you do casts a vote for the kind of person you think you are. So as you make progress towards goals, not only do you have the reward of having achieved progress, you have the confidence in the identity capital. I'm going to connect this really quickly, lastly, to research on future self, and then I'm going to give you some of the mechanics of a morning routine that you can use so that you can increasingly have insane motivation, positive emotions, and an amazing relationship with your own self, so that you're raising that baseline of success rather than lowering it. So what the research on future self shows is that as people, most people are not connected with their long-term future self. You need to have a connection and a relationship and a clear vision of your long-term future self if you want to have quality behavior in the present. This is what Dr. Hal Hershfield has found, is that as a person, and there's a lot of research on this in psychology, as people, who we are and what we're doing is based on our view of and our commitment to our future self. Most people's future self is not very far out. Most people are living day to day, week to week, month to month. There's a great quote in the book, The 50th Law by Robert Greene and 50 Cent. And they say, by our nature as rational, conscious creatures, we cannot help but think of the future. But most people out of fear, and I'll also say by most people out of addiction, they limit their view of the future to just a few days ahead, maybe the week ahead, maybe a vague plan for the months. But we're generally dealing with so many immediate battles or so many short-term dopamine hits that we're not lifting our gaze. And so they say in the book, it is a law of power that the further and deeper we contemplate the future, the more we can shape it to our desires. Most people are dealing with a near immediate future self. Their future self isn't very far out. Instead, they're just dealing with getting to social media, getting to the weekend, getting to the end of the day, paying the bills. And that's actually what Dr. Hal Hershfield has found. He said it's really hard for people to connect to their long-term future self because the pull of the present is too powerful. The rewards of the present are immediate, whereas if you're going to start investing in your bigger term future self, such as getting really in shape, developing skills, building a retirement nest egg, those things, the reward is out there. Whereas if you just seek short-term cheap dopamine, you can have the reward right now, but you're left with a really crappy future self. And that's what most people's dilemma is because they're not connected to a long-term future self, they're seeking short-term dopamine hits, which is ultimately costing their long-term future self massively. There's actually a TED Talk called The Battle Between Your Present and Your Future Self. And in that, the psychologist who gave that talk talks about how it's an unfair battle between the present and the future self, because the future self is not present, whereas the present self can pick up a donut and start eating it and get the rewards. And so it's just an unfair advantage to the present self if you're not connected and committed to your future self. However, if you get clear and committed to your future self, and if you start making progress towards your goals and start building massive confidence and massive momentum, then your future self can drive the ship, and you can start having a bigger and bigger vision for your future self. And as you start having a bigger vision for your future self, your present life gets better and better. There's actually a great quote on this from Dan Sullivan. He said, the only way to make your present better is by making your future bigger. So you want to have a massive vision of your future self that's driving everything you do here and now. And again, this connects right back to the research on future self by Dr. Hal Hershfield. He talks about how the clearer and more committed you get to your future self, the better decisions you make in the present. You start investing towards retirement, and you stop spending so much on junk. You start eating better. You stop engaging in wasteful or destructive behaviors and habits. You can't really improve your behavior in the present unless you improve your vision of your future, because without having a purpose or a reason to improve your behavior, you won't do it. That's the willpower approach to change. You need a why before you focus on the how, and the why is your vision for your future self and what you're striving to accomplish. This morning routine is going to help you increasingly build a vision towards your future self and start making the right tangible progress towards that. So when you wake up, how you start something often shapes the momentum of it. And most people, they start their day in a negative way. They start immediately scrolling. In fact, there's a lot of research that shows that within 5 to 10 minutes, people are already reactively scrolling through either email, social media, or already watching dopamine-inducing media. And so immediately people start rewarding themselves or draining their dopamine in a negative way. They're immediately rewarding themselves with cheap, negative dopamine and creating immediate, essentially rewards before they've even done anything. Rather than immediately rewarding yourself, you want to get up and start building towards your future self. You want to start making progress. You want a routine that gets you in flow. You want to start getting short wins. There's actually a great book called Make Your Bed that talks about how if you just make your bed first thing in the morning, you've already started to build wins. You've already started to build momentum and progress in the right way. I would also argue you want to have clear goals that were set the night before. Right before you go to bed, you want to be clear on what your purpose is for tomorrow, so that when you wake up the next day, you already have a purpose. You're already clear on what you're trying to accomplish. And you should have no more than 3 goals to accomplish each day. There's a great book called Good to Great by Jim Collins. He said, if you have more than 3 priorities, you have none. And I would argue that's true as well on a daily basis. Not only do you want 3 overarching clear priorities towards your future self, but on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, you don't want 10 items on your to-do list. That creates too much decision fatigue. On your daily to-do list, you don't want 10 things. Maybe you want 2 or 3 max. Because according to the 80-20 rule, 80% of your results comes from 20% of what you do. And most people are busy but not productive. And so rather than trying to accomplish 10 things, you really just want to accomplish maybe 2 or 3, the most important things that have the highest leverage, the highest impact. What are the most important things you could accomplish today that would make the biggest impact? So have no more than 3 items on your to-do list when you wake up, so that you can wake up with a purpose. And these are the 80-20. These are the few things that if you accomplish will give you a massive reward. Now, there's another principle that you want to apply, and that's the idea that your input shapes your outlook. Rather than consuming mindless media, which is basically just candy, it's like living on a candy diet. Most people are shaping their worldview and their motivation with a junk diet, a junk media diet. You want to consume only high quality information, quality over quantity. So reading good books, spiritual books, scriptures, history, whatever. You want to fill your mind with quality that is stimulating in a challenging way, that forces you to think, maybe take notes. Rather than just being fed trash media, you actually want to be consuming challenging media, education over entertainment. Using the 80-20 rule as well. You want to have 80% of the input that you have be educational, whereas 20% is entertainment. Certainly it's good to have entertainment. It's good to relax, recover, but that should come after you actually have built something. You've worked, you've actually learned. You reward yourself after the work is a principle that we all learn growing up, but perhaps as adults, we stop applying that principle. So you wake up with a plan, no more than 2 or 3 items on the to-do list, and you get moving. I would say that key aspects of a morning routine are get some small wins so that you're generating momentum, make progress towards your big picture vision. So whatever that is for you, whatever your future self is. For me, my future self is a writer. I've got 6 kids, and so I'm working towards my family. I've got very clear goals, and I'm making progress towards those goals in the morning when my mind is fresh. There's a lot of research that shows that your brain is most creative first thing in the morning. Another really brilliant morning activity is simply journaling. Journaling first thing in the morning. Josh Waitzkin, who's the author of The Art of Learning, talks a lot about this. When you first wake up in the morning, your subconscious has been doing so many amazing things. It's been forming memories, but it's also been learning and working out your problems, especially if you went to bed the night before visualizing your problems. There's a great quote from Thomas Edison. He said, never go to bed without a request to your subconscious. And so if you go to bed thinking about your vision, visualizing your goals, and then go to bed, your subconscious will have actually probably worked out a lot of that. And so when you pop into your journal and your brain's already immediately creative, and I would actually challenge you to journal in a different environment. I actually like getting into my car, driving, after I've hydrated, drink a ton of water, and journaling in my car because it's quiet. You can then write about your goals or write about the things you're trying to accomplish. I often will write about the books I'm writing, and it's amazing how many insights that I get because my mind is so fresh and because my subconscious has just worked it out. If you wake up and immediately start inputting, you start putting new information in your brain, then you lose access to what your subconscious did that not all night. But if instead of inputting, you go straight to output, start dumping into your journal your thoughts, then you can start accessing the gold mine of your subconscious. Wake up with a plan. Give yourself space to journal and reflect, but also visualize and write about your goals. I would also say journal with gratitude journal. So now you're boosting all of the right neurochemicals, I could say, gratitude, and then ultimately you make progress towards your goals. You start making progress towards your goals, you start moving forward. This is a morning routine that if you do, you can start making massive progress towards your future self. I love the quote that you make or break your life before 8 a.m. I applied these principles to become a professional author while I was a foster parent of 3 kids and completing a PhD program. What I would do is I would wake up at 5 a.m. I would go to the gym at Clemson University. That's where I was doing my PhD. The gym didn't open until 5:30. And so once I got to the gym, I would write in my journal for about 15 minutes. I'd write about my goals. I'd write about the problems I'm trying to solve. I'd write about the articles that I was going to write because I was writing a lot of blog posts. And it's amazing how much insight and inspiration I got. And then I'd go work out for about 45 minutes, and then I'd go and write blog posts. And then I'd have my first class at like 8 a.m., but I consistently published. I love the quote, better prolific than perfect. I was publishing over a couple of years. I published hundreds of blog posts, and those blog posts got viewed by over 100 million people, which led me to becoming a professional author as a PhD student because I used my morning routine, and because I was clear and connected on my future self, and because rather than waking up and dipping into short-term dopamine, I used my dopamine as fuel and motivation towards my future self. And as you make progress towards your future self, then you start to build massive confidence, identity capital, and confidence actually fuels more motivation. So as you build more confidence, you actually have a higher well or a bigger source of quality dopamine to use towards bigger and more healthy, more challenging, more epic goals. So you absolutely can use a morning routine to create a healthy relationship with dopamine where you use dopamine, it doesn't use you. You create a higher and higher baseline or a bigger well of motivational resources you can use to create bigger goals, rather than basically injecting yourself with fake dopamine and setting yourself up for failure, setting up your future self up for failure. There's nothing worse than living a life of regret. And if you get older and older and you basically are becoming the worst version of yourself, or you're not living your dreams, and you look back on regret, you see all the time you wasted basically just consuming junk. And consumption leads to more consumption. If you consume short-term rewards, you'll need more and more dosages of it because the reward is so short-term. Whereas if you're actually using your dopamine to achieve massive goals, you actually get the long-term benefits of achievement because you feel great about achieving massive results. You feel good to accomplish, whereas you don't feel good if you're constantly needing to consume shorter and shorter term dopamine, and then ultimately setting up your future self for disaster, putting your future self in debt. I look at it as it's the difference between investing in your future self or costing your future self. You could seek short-term dopamine, which ultimately costs your future self, making your future self fatter or more in debt in all ways, emotionally, financially, or you can invest in your future self and make your future self more and more wealthy, successful, healthy, and happy. And as you invest in your future self, your life gets better and better. So I challenge you to use your morning routines to make your future self bigger, to invest in your future self, and ultimately to create a powerful, epic relationship with dopamine. Because as you do, you'll have more motivation, more confidence, more identity capital. Your past will get better, your future will get bigger, and your present will be powerful. You'll live better and better days. It's not about working harder. It's about having the fuel, the energy, the motivation to be in flow and to succeed. If you study Olympians such as Michael Phelps and others, you find that they spend a lot of time visualizing their future self. They spend a lot of time at night specifically, but also before they practice and just throughout their day, visualizing themselves achieving their dreams, visualizing themselves on that podium winning gold, visualizing themselves doing the perfect performance. They spend a lot of time visualizing their future self, and there's a huge amount of research that shows that in order to actually engage in what psychologists call deliberate practice is how you develop skills and abilities and ultimately transform yourself into someone who's an expert at something. The only way to engage in that level of practice and training on a daily basis, where you become elite at what you do, is to have a clear version of your future self, a clear vision of your future self. Dr. Joe Dispenza talks about the importance of visualizing, seeing, thinking about your future self.
Feeling connected to your future, feeling the inspiration, the joy, feeling the exuberance, the love for your future every day is going to, just like your body follows your mind to the coffee maker, to the toilet every morning, to the known, your body is going to follow your mind right into that future because that's where your attention and your energy is.
There's even a great book called As a Man Thinketh, and in that book, he talks about how your mind is like a garden and your thoughts are the seeds. Most people's mind, or their garden of their mind, is overrun with weeds. They're not in control of their garden, just like it's run wild. And so one of the first steps is obviously tilling the ground, completely clearing it, and then planting the right seeds so that those seeds bear fruit. And so what you think about and what you feel creates your future self. And my question for you is, how much time do you actually spend visualizing your future self? How much time do you spend seeing it, feeling it, creating it, being grateful for it? Neville Goddard said, assume the feeling of your wish fulfilled. Do you know who your future self is? Do you actually see yourself being there? Do you spend time thinking about your future self in the negative, where you're expecting poor health in the future or poor financial situations? Are you creating negative outcomes by the thoughts you're planting? Or are you proactively planting the right seeds? Are you proactively planting and visualizing and seeing a beautiful vision of your future self? Visualizing your future self, especially at night before you go to bed, seeing that and then spending your days creating it and living into that, performing into your future self is crucial. If you're not spending time visualizing your future self and also writing down your goals, writing them down, writing down the achievements of them, if you're not spending your life chasing and creating your future self and living intentionally, then what are you doing? You're actually living your life by default. You're just going through the motions. You're not actually doing anything. You're not being creative. You're not taking action. You're not using your agency as a human being. So the first step is actually choosing who your future self is. It's okay to choose something, and even if you don't believe it's possible yet, it's okay to choose something even before you visualize it, but choose it. Even if you choose, being in a happy relationship or being an entrepreneur or getting to a certain level of income or whatever it is, connecting with God, whatever it is, choose something even before you believe it, and then write it down. Then spend time visualizing it and seeing it and spending more and more time seeing it. Even if you don't feel like it's honest, spend your time seeing it. Spend your time writing about it, and then get to the point where you accept it. As you start taking action towards it, and as you just embrace that this is your future self, this is your identity, this is who you're going to be, you get to the point where you accept that this is just who you're becoming. This is who you are. And then as you take action towards your future self, you eventually integrate your future self. So you first start by choosing your future self, and you're the only person who can choose who you're going to be. But you have to choose who your future self is, or by default, your future self will just become someone. You don't want to set your future self up for disaster. So you might as well choose who your future self is. There's a great quote that says the best way to predict the future is to choose it, or to decide it and design it. And so choose your future self, or else someone else will. Only you can choose your future self. Then spend time seeing it, visualizing it, and then eventually you accept it. You just accept that this is your future self. This is who you're going to become. This is what's going to happen. You can stop doubting it. As you're taking action, your confidence will increase. Your expectancy will increase, and eventually you just get to the point where you accept your future self. You expect that this is who you are, this is who you're becoming. And then you integrate your future self. Every step forward you're taking power moves, you're taking actions towards your future self. You slowly and over time integrate the habits, the environment, the friends, the media. One of the great things is your input shapes your outlook. And so as you're weeding out, and that's really what you're doing with the garden of your mind, you're weeding out your former self. You're weeding out your former habits. You're weeding out the things you used to say yes to, and you now say no to those things. You've weeded out things, and you're now planting better seeds. You're planting with more intention. You're planting better seeds. You're planting higher quality seeds, and you're planting a more fruitful garden. of your life, and you're creating better and better outcomes, but you're the one who has to decide what that garden looks like. And you've got to be the one to plant those, and you've got to nourish those thoughts. And you train your thoughts by writing down your goals, by training your inputs, by telling people about your future self. There's a lot of research actually by Robert Cialdini. He talks about a principle called the principle of consistency. And as human beings, we have a desire to be consistent with our words. And so not only do you choose your future self, but you proclaim your future self. Bo Easton would say you declare your future self. You say, this is who I am, this is who I'm going to be, this is what I'm going to accomplish. This is where I'm going to go, this is who I'm going to become, this is the life I'm going to create. By stating those things and by declaring them and by affirming them, you start to have a sense and a desire to be consistent with those. And as you take action towards those, often courageous actions, power moves towards your future self. You start to integrate. You start to build an environment around your future self. Marshall Goldsmith said, if you do not create and control your environment will create and control you. Integration means you're actually taking the actions you make. You're taking big leaps, and then you integrate it rather than reverting back. Reverting back would be having what Gay Hendricks would call an upper limit problem. He talks about that in the book, The Big Leap, where you make a step forward, but then because you're starting to feel good and you're starting to feel successful, you revert back to your comfort zone, which is feeling guilty or unworthy or whatever deep psychological issues hold us all back from success. And so you want to continuously integrate. As you learn something or as you improve, you set that as a new foundation for your current self, and then you keep improving. You have better friends around you, have better habits, you have a better environment, you've got better expectations, better measurements of success. You continuously integrate what you're learning along the way so that it just becomes a system and an aspect of yourself. And then you release your former self. You give yourself permission to just release your former self. Permission to not be who you used to be. Permission to forgive your former self. Permission to no longer be defined by your former self. In his book, Think Again, Adam Grant, the organizational psychologist, he talks about the importance of not attaching your current self to your former identity. A lot of times your former self made decisions or made commitments or took actions that no longer resonate with your current self. You can release your former self. You don't have to have any negative energy. In fact, you shouldn't have negative energy towards your former self. But as you're accepting your future self, as you're taking action towards your future self, as you're integrating your future self, you want to just release your former self. Let go of your former self. No longer be who you used to be. No longer say yes to what you used to say yes to. No longer believe what you used to believe. You actually are just continuously improving how you see the world, how you act, the clarity of your vision, the clarity of your action, the clarity of your word, the clarity of your integrity, the clarity of your morality. You're continuously improving your future self, and you're releasing your former self. And you're not the same person you were before, and you don't need to see the world the same way you did before. And you don't need to take the same actions you did before. You just release your former self every step of the way. So my invitation to you is visualize your future self, see your future self, feel your future self, be grateful to your future self. One of the things that Dr. Joe Dispenza said, and there's a lot of research on this, even in the realm of epigenetics, your brain doesn't know the difference between a visualization and an actual experience.
The act of closing your eyes, as an athlete, you know this, and you begin to rehearse in your mind, mentally rehearse what you're about to do, begins to install the neurological hardware in your brain to look like you've already done it. Now the brain is no longer a record of the past. It's now a map to the future. And if you keep hitting that hardware over and over again, the hardware is going to become a software program. And who knows? You just may start acting like a happy person. There's no magic there.
And so if you visualize and if you feel grateful for an experience, your brain will begin to wire that as your reality. And then you'll start to actually manifest that reality. And so spend time visualizing, seeing, feeling, and being grateful for your future self, feeling those experiences, seeing them, rehearsing them, just like you would, just like a performer would rehearse an experience, just like an Olympian would rehearse an experience. And then you watch yourself perform and actually get better and better at actually creating the experiences in real life as you had in your visualizations. And then you can create that. You can create the outcomes you want. I can tell you this works. I recently wrote a book, and I spent some time visualizing what I want that book to look and feel like. And it's totally that. It's exactly what I wanted. And you are a creator. And the more time you spend visualizing and creating specifics, and then watching yourself create specifics, not generalities, creating specifics. What's a specific experience you want to have, or a specific result you want to create, or in a specific environment you want to create? The more you visualize specifics and then create those specifics, the more confidence you have. And then confidence creates the realm for more imagination. Albert Einstein actually said that imagination is more important than knowledge, but imagination is largely based on your level of confidence. And so as you even create small wins and celebrate those wins, then your imagination increases, and then with that increased imagination comes increased action and increased courage. And as you take more courageous actions, your confidence will continue to increase. So create with your imagination, create specifics with your mind, feel it, and spend time visualizing yourself. Spend time visualizing your future self. It's such a beautiful, important thing. Obviously, it's not enough. It's not enough to just think about it. You got to actually take bold action. One of the things I love about the book, The 10X Rule by Grant Cardone, is he says, not only do you want to have 10X vision, but you need to take 10X action. You need to take 10X the type of action and the quality and the consistency of action than you think you should. So it's not just about seeing. You do have to take 10X action. You actually have to engage in the behaviors of your future self. You got to actually apply courage. You got to take action. You got to be bold. You miss every shot you don't take. But those shots, you're not worried about making or missing every shot. You're just worried about taking action, and your actions begin to reflect your future self. Your environment begins to reflect your future self. Your situation begins to reflect your future self. Your income begins to reflect your future self. So who is your future self? That's my question. Who is your future self? Do you see that person? Are you clear on it? What are the specifics of that future self that you're now going to go create? I'm Dr. Benjamin Hardy. I hope you liked this video. Please give it a thumbs up. Cheers to your future self. Please like and subscribe to this channel. Learn the science of their future self. Have an amazing day.